In the lonely silence of the frontier, a towering cowboy lives with nothing but his cattle and ghosts. He hasn't spoken to a woman in over a decade until one stormy night, a desperate figure appears bare, scarred and weeping on his porch. He offers her shelter. But what she carries isn't just shame and sorrow hidden in her satchel, is a secret deed that could change the fate of every rancher in the county. And there's a preacher out there who will burn everything to steal it back. The fire of justice, the whispers of prejudice, the thunder of hooves in the night. When a broken cowboy dares to protect a woman the world scorns, the line between mercy and ruin vanishes in the dust. Will he risk his land, his life, and his soul to defend her? Or will the darkness of the frontier swallow them both? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The bitter wind howled across the prairie, rattling the shutters of Ezekiel Harrow's weathered cabin like angry fists against wood. Inside, the big rancher moved with the steady rhythm of a man long accustomed to solitude. His massive frame cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as he worked by lamplight. The familiar scent of leather and saddle soap filling the kitchen. Scout. His aging cattle dog lay curled near the dying embers in the hearth. Only the creaking floorboards and the occasional whine from Scout broke the silence as Ezekiel's calloused hands worked the leather reins. He'd learned to find comfort in these quiet evening hours, though they hadn't always been so lonely. Reckon that'll hold now, he murmured to Scout, his deep voice rough from disuse. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor in response. Speaking aloud helped ward off the crushing weight of silence, even if his only audience had 4 legs and a tail. Rain began to pelt the cabin's tin roof, starting as scattered drops before building to a steady drumming. Ezekiel glanced at the window, where darkness pressed against the glass. The storm had arrived sooner than he'd expected. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the empty chair where Sarah used to sit, mending by the fire. Even after 7 years, the sight of that chair still caught at his heart. He carefully put away his work, hanging the mended tack on its peg with practiced care. The lamp flame wavered as another gust rattled the cabin. Time to turn in. Scout raised his head, ears pricking forward as Ezekiel reached for the lamp. The pounding on the door hit like gunshots in the quiet cabin. Scout leaped to his feet, barking sharply. Ezekiel froze, his hands still extended toward the lamp. The pounding came again, desperate and frantic. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, throwing the heavy bolt back. Wind and rain burst in as he yanked the door open. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating a sight that stopped his breath cold. A woman stood sobbing on his porch, completely naked, her body streaked with rain and mud. The flash of lightning revealed angry welts across her shoulders and back. Whip marks, fresh and cruel. "Please," she gasped, her teeth chattering. "Please don't send me away." Her arms were wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at modesty, but couldn't hide the evidence of abuse marked across her flesh. For a moment, Ezekiel stood paralyzed. In 7 years of solitude, he'd never faced a situation like this. The woman swayed on her feet, clearly at the end of her strength. Christian charity and basic human decency warred with his instinct to shut the door on this complicated situation. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, making his decision. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in out of the rain, ma'am." She stumbled across the threshold, leaving muddy footprints on his floor. Scout circled uncertainly, whining. Ezekiel's mind raced ahead to practical matters. The woman needed covering, and quick. "Wait here," he said gruffly, already striding toward the bedroom. He yanked open the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't touched in 7 years. Sarah's things still lay there, carefully preserved. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out her heavy winter robe, the soft blue wool still smelling faintly of the lavender she'd loved. When he returned to the kitchen, the woman hadn't moved from where he'd left her. She stood, shivering violently, her arms still crossed over herself, head bowed. Water pooled around her feet on the plank floor. "Here." He held out the robe, careful to keep his eyes averted. "Put this on before you catch your death." Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely grasp the fabric. Without a word, he helped her slip her arms into the sleeves, keeping his touch as clinical and impersonal as possible. The robe that had fit Sarah's slight frame hung loose on this woman's fuller figure. But at least it covered her. As soon as she was decent, Ezekiel turned to stoke the fire. The woman's legs gave way and she sank to her knees, crying into her hands. The sound of her weeping filled the cabin, raw with exhaustion and fear. Scout padded over to her, nose twitching. After a careful sniff, he pressed against her side, offering warmth and comfort in his simple dog way. The woman's hand found his fur, clutching it like a lifeline. Ezekiel stood awkwardly by the hearth, at a loss. He hadn't dealt with a crying woman since Sarah passed. The skills for offering comfort had grown rusty with disuse. Instead, he focused on practical matters, moving to put the kettle on and gather clean cloths and his medical kit. Whoever had taken a whip to this woman's back would need tending to. "Can you tell me your name, ma'am?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle as he could manage. She drew a shuddering breath, slowly lowering her hands from her face. In the firelight, he could see she was neither young nor old, somewhere in her early 30s, perhaps. Her features showed mixed blood, with high Cherokee or Choctaw cheekbones and skin the color of sun-warmed honey. Despite her obvious distress, there was dignity in how she held herself. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Bellworthing." Her voice was hoarse, as if from screaming. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this, sir. I didn't know where else to go." "Harrow," he responded. "And you're not imposing?" No decent man would turn away someone in need. He poured hot water into a cup, adding a generous spoonful of honey. "Drink this. It'll help warm you up." She accepted the cup with trembling hands, sipping carefully. Some of the desperate terror had faded from her eyes, though she still watched him warily. Scout remained pressed against her side, his solid presence seemingly giving her courage. "Those marks on your back need tending," Ezekiel said after she'd drunk half the tea. "I've got supplies, if you'll permit me to help. Or I can ride for the doctor, though it's a fair distance in this weather." Clara Bell shook her head quickly. "No, doctor, please. They'll find me if you do." The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Ezekiel's jaw tightened as he thought about the kind of men who would do this to a woman. He'd seen such cruelty before, during the war, but never expected to find it on his doorstep. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "No one's going to harm you under my roof." He meant it as simple fact, but saw something ease in her posture at his words. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know this must seem," she gestured helplessly at herself, at the situation. "I swear I'm not in the habit of appearing naked on strangers' porches in the middle of the night." A ghost of a smile touched Ezekiel's mouth at her attempt at dignity. "In such circumstances, reckon these aren't usual times for either of us, ma'am." He busied himself gathering what he'd need to treat her injuries, giving her time to collect herself. The kettle whistled, and he added more hot water to her cup. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain drumming on the roof and wind howling through the eaves. But inside the cabin, a fragile sense of sanctuary had begun to form. Clara Bell sat quietly now, one hand still buried in Scout's fur while she sipped her tea. The borrowed robe puddled around her, making her seem smaller than she was. But there was steel in her spine, Ezekiel noted. Whatever had brought her to his door, she wasn't broken by it. "The back room's yours for the night," he said, setting. The medical supplies on the table. We can sort everything else out in the morning. For now, let's just get you patched up and rested." She nodded, clearly too exhausted to argue. "You're very kind, Mr. Harrow." "Ezekiel," he corrected automatically. "And it's not kindness. Just doing what needs doing. The simplicity of that statement seemed to reach her. Some of the wariness left her eyes as she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Ezekiel felt the weight of her assessment, knowing what she saw. A giant of a man. Weathered by sun and hard work, closer to 50 than 40. Not much to inspire trust, he thought. But she must have found something worthy in his face, because she gave a small nod. "Ezekiel, then?" she said softly. "I'm much obliged to you." "More than I can say." He merely grunted in response, uncomfortable. "With gratitude, let's see to those wounds before infection sets in. Then you can rest." The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but its fury seemed diminished now. Inside, the fire crackled warmly as Ezekiel gathered his supplies. Scout had appointed himself Clara Belle's guardian, refusing to leave her side. And though neither of them could know it yet, this night would mark the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. For now, though, there was only this moment, a battered woman finding refuge, a lonely man offering shelter, and God's grace manifest in the simple act of mercy between strangers. Dawn crept over the horizon as Ezekiel moved quietly around his kitchen. The familiar routine of breakfast making felt different this morning, knowing he had a guest sleeping in Sarah's old room. He worked the biscuit dough with practiced hands, the soft pat-pat of flour against the wooden board the only sound besides. The crackling fire, the smell of fresh biscuits and frying eggs finally drew Clara Belle from the back room. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, still wearing Sarah's blue robe, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden, fading bruises along her jaw and throat. "Good morning," she said, softly pulling the robe tighter around herself. Ezekiel nodded, gesturing to the table. "Sit. Food's nearly ready." She settled into a chair, her movements careful and measured. Scout, who'd apparently appointed himself her guardian, patted over to rest his head on her knee. Her hand found his fur automatically, as if drawing comfort. From the contact, "I expect you're hungry," Ezekiel said, setting a plate before her. Steam rose from the golden biscuits and perfectly cooked eggs. "Yes, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I should explain about last night. Eat first," he interrupted gently. "Talk can wait till you've got some strength back." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Clara devoured her food like someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, though she tried to maintain proper manners. Ezekiel pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes on his own plate. Finally, she set down her fork. "I ran away from Pastor Elias Quarles's traveling revival show," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He would parade me before crowds, make mock of my size and heritage. I caught it. Demonstrating God's mercy to the unfortunate. Her hands trembled slightly. "Last night, I couldn't take any more of his cruelty. I fled during the storm." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Man of God acting like that ain't no true pastor." Before Clara could respond, Scout's ears pricked up. A moment later, Ezekiel heard it too, the distant thunder of approaching horses. "Quick," he said, rising up to the loft. "Don't make a sound." Clara scrambled up the ladder just as hoofbeats entered the yard. Ezekiel moved to the door, opening it to find 6 mounted men, Pastor Quarles at their head. The preacher sat his horse like a man used to being looked up to, his black coat immaculate despite the early hour. "Morning, Harrow," Quarles called. Out, his voice smooth as honey. "Sorry to trouble you so early, but we're searching for a woman. Ran off from my revival meeting last night. Poor, confused soul. not right in the head. Seen anyone matching that description? Ezekiel filled his doorframe, arms crossed. No women here, Pastor, just me and my dog. Quarles' smile didn't reach his eyes. Mind if we take a look around? For the poor woman's own safety, you understand? I do mind, Ezekiel replied evenly. Got no call to search a man's home without cause. Now, brother, Quarles leaned forward in his saddle. Surely you wouldn't obstruct God's work. This woman needs help, spiritual guidance. Reckon any guidance she needs, she can find elsewhere. Ezekiel's voice held steel beneath its calm surface. My property's private, Pastor. Best move along. The two men locked eyes for a long moment. Finally, Quarles straightened, his friendly manner dropping away like a shed skin. We'll be back. Harrow with the sheriff, if need be. Think carefully about whose side you want to be on. The posse wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they rode away. Ezekiel waited until they were well out of sight before closing the door. It's safe now, he called up to the loft. Clara descended shakily, her face pale. Thank you, she whispered. If they'd found me, they didn't. He cut her off. And they won't. That evening, as Ezekiel swept the kitchen floor, his broom caught on something near the hearth. Clara's worn leather satchel lay half hidden in the shadows, forgotten in last night's chaos. He picked it up, meaning to return it to her room. The bag's flap fell open, revealing a folded document bearing the county clerk's official seal. Ezekiel's conscience warred briefly with curiosity before he carefully unfolded the paper. His eyes widened as he read. It was a deed establishing Clara Bellworthing's legal ownership of Silver Creek Spring, the same spring his cattle depended on for survival. He stood there, broom forgotten in his hand, staring at the document that complicated everything. From the back room came the soft sound of Clara humming as she mended one of Sarah's old dresses. The simple tune floated through the cabin like a ghost of gentler times, making his discovery feel all the more weighty. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale gold. Frost glittered on the grass outside Ezekiel's cabin, and his breath made clouds in the crisp morning air as he led to horses from the barn. Scalp bounded around his feet. Eager for the day's adventure, Clara emerged from the cabin wearing borrowed clothes, an old work shirt and trousers cinched tight with rope, both hanging loose on her frame. She'd plaited her dark hair into a single thick braid, and some of yesterday's fear had left her eyes, replaced by quiet determination. You sure you're up to riding? Ezekiel asked, adjusting the stirrups on his wife's old saddle. I grew up on horseback, Clara replied, running a gentle hand along the mare's neck. My father made sure of that, at least. They mounted up and set out across the scrubland, Scout trotting ahead. The morning sun did little to warm the air, and Clara pulled her borrowed coat tighter. They rode in companionable silence for a while, hooves crunching on frost-covered ground. Your father, Ezekiel said finally. He was the one who secured the water rights. Clara nodded. John Worthing. Ta. My mother was white. Ta. He knew the value of water out here, fought hard to keep the spring in our family's hands. She smiled sadly. Said it wasn't just about the water itself, but about holding on to something that was ours by right. The trail wound through patches of scraggly mesquite and past wind-carved rock formations. Ezekiel noticed Clara rode well, despite her obvious stiffness from recent injuries. She sat straight in the saddle, scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. How'd you end up with Quarles' outfit? He asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of the question. Clara was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. After Father died, I tried making my way teaching school. But some folks, they didn't want their children taught by someone like me. Her voice hardened. Quarles found me when I was desperate for work, said he needed educated folks for his revival show. Promised good pay and Christian fellowship. She gave a bitter laugh. It didn't take long to see what kind of fellowship he had in mind. They crested a low rise, and Ezekiel pointed ahead. There's your spring. Clear water bubbled up from a crack in the rocky ground, forming a deep pool before flowing away in a steady stream. Even in the worst drought years, Shadow Spring Creek had never run dry. Ezekiel had always wondered how deep the source went. They dismounted, and Clara knelt beside the pool, trailing her fingers in the crystal water. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Father used to tell me stories about this place." Said the water came straight from the heart of the earth. Ezekiel looked around with new eyes, seeing not just the spring that watered his cattle, but what it could become. With proper development, this source could support a whole settlement, crops, orchards, maybe even a proper town someday. "Your claim," he said carefully, "it's not just for the spring itself, but all the water rights downstream." Clara nodded, still watching the ripples spread from her fingers. "That's what the deed says. Father made sure everything was legal and proper, registered with both tribal and territory authorities." She looked up at him. "Your cattle depend on this water, don't they?" "They do." Ezekiel didn't see any point in denying it. "Been using this spring 20 years now, since my father's time." The ride back was quieter, both lost in thought as the sun sank toward the horizon. Scout flushed a jackrabbit from beneath a bush, but didn't give chase. Staying close to the horses instead, evening found them at Ezekiel's kitchen table, sharing a pot of beef stew. Clara had insisted on helping cook, and the cabin felt warmer somehow with two people moving around the kitchen. The familiar sense of sage and rosemary filled the air as they ate. "I can't remember the last time I felt this safe," Clara said, softly breaking a piece of cornbread. "Just sitting at a proper table, eating a meal without fear." She looked down at her bowl. "But Quarles won't let this rest. He's not a man who accepts losing what he thinks belongs to him. No, Ezekiel?" "Agreed. I expect he won't." The thought of his herd, of the land he'd worked so hard to keep alive through drought and hard times, weighed heavy on his mind. Protecting Clara meant risking everything he'd built. But watching her across the table, seeing the quiet strength in her, despite all she'd endured, he felt something long dormant stirring in his heart. Like water breaking through hard ground, hope was finding its way back into his world. "Thank you," Clara said, meeting his eyes. "For all of this, for treating me like a person worth helping." Ezekiel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, the wind whispered through the junipers. And somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across Ezekiel's ranch yard as he hitched the team to his wagon. He'd spent an hour brushing and currying the matched pair of bays until their coats gleamed like polished copper. The wooden wagon bed, scrubbed clean of mud, held fresh hay and a quilt for comfortable seating. Clara appeared in the doorway, wearing the best dress they'd managed to piece together, one of his late wife Sarah's, carefully altered. The dark blue calico suited her, even if it pulled a bit tight across her shoulders. She'd woven wildflowers into her thick, dark braid. "We don't have to go," she said quietly, watching him check the harness straps. Ezekiel straightened to his full height. "Yes, we do." His voice was gentle but firm. "Can't hide forever. Ain't right, ain't Christian." Clara's fingers worried at her skirt. "Folk will talk. Let him." He offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. "The Lord sees true, even when people don't." The 10-mile journey to Copper Butte passed mostly in silence, broken only by birdsong and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Clara sat straight-backed beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Though Ezekiel noticed how she gripped her fingers tighter as the town's wooden buildings came into view. Main Street was already busy with churchgoers when they rolled in. Ladies, in their Sunday best, hurrying along the boardwalk while men gathered in small clusters, discussing cattle prices and weather. The talk died down as Ezekiel's wagon passed, replaced by pointed stares and whispers behind raised hands. "Look at the size of her," someone muttered. "Like a bear in a dress. Heard she's part Indian," another voice carried. Running some kind of water rights scheme. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. Guiding the team toward the hitching post outside the white clapboard church, Clara sat impossibly straighter, her face a careful mask. The small church was already half full when they entered. Heads turned, and the rustling of fancy skirts seemed especially loud as ladies shifted away, leaving empty pews on either side. Ezekiel led Clara to a seat near the middle, positioning himself between her and the aisle like a shield. Pastor Quarles stood at the pulpit, his usually smooth features twisted in barely concealed displeasure. His eyes locked onto Clara for a long moment before he opened his Bible with deliberate slowness. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Today's sermon concerns the wages of sin and how the devil may appear in unexpected forms to test our righteousness." Throughout the service, Quarles's words seemed aimed like arrows at their pew. He spoke of false prophets, of those who would divide good Christian communities, of maintaining proper order. Clara never flinched, though Ezekiel could feel the tension in her shoulder where it pressed against his arm. When the final hymn ended, they filed out with the congregation. On the church steps, Mrs. Whitaker, the banker's wife, deliberately turned her back. Her voice carried clearly to think. Ezekiel Harrow harboring such a creature. His poor Sarah must be turning in her grave. Clara stopped walking. For a moment, Ezekiel thought she might crumble under the cruel words. Instead, she turned to face the gathered townsfolk, her voice clear and steady as she quoted, "I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto him, and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed." The whispers faltered. Even Mrs. Whitaker's pinched face showed a flicker of uncertainty. "The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them," Clara continued, her words falling like gentle rain on parched ground. "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him." Ezekiel stood beside her, straight and tall as a pine tree. His massive presence and Clara's quiet dignity created a moment of uncomfortable silence among the gossips. Later, while Clara visited the general store for supplies, Ezekiel stepped into the Red Dog Saloon. Sunday or not, he needed a drink. The usual crowd of cowhands and miners fell quiet as he entered, but he ignored them, settling his large frame at the bar. "Whiskey," he told the barkeep, laying down a coin. Behind him, he could hear the muttered conversations. "The spring's been open-range water for 20 years, someone growled. "Now this half-breed woman shows up with some piece of paper. My cattle water there," another voice added. "What happens when she decides to fence it off? Harrow's a fool to get mixed up in this mess. Man used to have sense." Ezekiel drained his whiskey and left without a word. The ride home was quiet again, but different now, heavy with things that needed saying. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Clara knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. The lamplight caught the scars on her arms, visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves. But there was nothing beaten or cowering in her posture. Ezekiel paused in the doorway, watching. Her lips moved silently, and tears tracked down her cheeks, but her face held peace he hadn't seen before. Something shifted in his chest, an ache he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Lord," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "give me strength to face whatever comes. And thank you for sending me to this place, to these people who showed me kindness when I had none left." Ezekiel stepped back quietly, leaving her to her prayers. In the kitchen, he stood at the window, looking out at the star-lit prairie. The wind whispered through the grass, And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called lonely, but unafraid. 2 days after the church confrontation, morning settled bright and clear over Ezekiel's ranch. The late summer heat already shimmered. Across the yard, as he and Clara shared a peaceful breakfast of cornbread and coffee. Scout's sudden barking broke their quiet routine. Through the window, dust clouds marked an approaching rider pushing his horse hard up the trail. Ezekiel recognized the proud posture and fancy black coat of Pastor Quarles, even before the man reined up at the hitching post. "Stay inside," Ezekiel told Clara softly, rising from the table. She nodded, but moved to stand near the window, where she could hear the cabin door creaked as Ezekiel stepped onto the porch. His boots thudded heavily against the wooden planks as he crossed his arms and waited. Scout growled low beside him. Quarles dismounted in a fluid motion, his polished boots raising puffs of dust. A leather document case was clutched in his grip. His usual smooth manner had an edge today, like a knife poorly hidden beneath fine cloth. "Mr. Harrow." Quarles didn't bother removing his hat. "I've come on urgent business regarding your guest." "Say your piece," Ezekiel replied evenly. Quarles pulled papers from his case with a flourish. "I have here documents proving that woman obtained her supposed deed through deception. The county clerk was fooled by her lies." His voice carried deliberate volume meant to reach inside. "I am the rightful owner of that spring, and you are harboring a fraud." The door opened behind Ezekiel. Clara stepped out, her chin lifted despite the slight tremor in her hands. "That's not true, and you know it, Pastor." "I know you tricked an old clerk with your sob story," Quarles sneered. "Just like you've tricked Mr. Harrow here with your helpless act." "My father's rights came through proper treaties," Clara said. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "The spring was granted to our people, to the Choctaw, before Oklahoma was even a territory. My father passed his claim to me, legal and binding." Quarles laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Listen to yourself. You expect these good Christian folk to honor some Indian woman's claim over a man of God." He waved his papers. "I've got witnesses ready to testify about your character. The whole town knows what you are." Ezekiel took a step forward, his shadow falling across Quarles. "That's enough." "No, it's not nearly enough," Quarles snapped. "I'm giving fair warning. Stop protecting this fraud, or I'll bring the law down on both of you. That spring will water good Christian farms, not some half-breed schemes." Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists. The urge to grab Quarles by his fancy coat and throw him off the property surged through his arms. Only Clara's soft touch on his elbow held him back. "You've said your piece," Ezekiel growled. "Now get off my land." Quarles straightened his jacket, trying to recover his dignity. "This isn't over. The town won't stand for it." He mounted his horse with less grace than before. "I'll be back with the sheriff if I have to." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. Scout continued growling until the rider disappeared around the bend. "I should have thrown him off the porch," Ezekiel muttered. "Violence won't help," Clara said quietly. "It would only prove his lies about me." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning was warm. "Maybe I should leave, spare you the trouble." "No." Ezekiel's response came swift and firm. "This is your fight now too. We'll face it proper." The day passed in tense silence. Ezekiel checked his rifle and pistol, cleaning them with careful attention, while Clara darned socks in her rocking chair. Neither mentioned Quarles' threats, but they hung in the air like storm clouds. As evening approached, Clara set aside her mending. "Would you join me on the porch? The stars will be out soon." Ezekiel nodded, grateful for the chance to ease the day's tension. They settled into the wooden chairs, watching purple shadows creep across the hills. A whippoorwill called in the distance. "My father loved nights like this," Clara said softly. He'd teach me songs in both languages, English hymns, and Choctaw melodies. She hummed a few notes, the tune strange and beautiful. That one's about stars being the campfires of ancestors watching over us. Sarah, my wife, she used to sing too. Ezekiel's voice roughened with disuse. Mostly lullabies for our girl. Been years since I thought about those songs. Would you share one? Clara asked gently. Ezekiel hesitated, then cleared his throat. In a low, rusty voice, he began, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." He stumbled on the second line, embarrassed, but Clara picked up the melody, her rich alto joining his baritone. Together, they finished the verse, their voices blending in the twilight. To his surprise, Ezekiel felt laughter bubbling up, real laughter, not bitter or angry, but warm like summer rain. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged overhead. Cricket song filled the cooling air. For all Quarles' threats and the uncertainty ahead, this moment held its own kind of peace. The simple harmony of two lonely souls finding connection under heaven's eternal watch. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Ezekiel hitched the wagon. Clara emerged from the cabin, wearing a simple brown dress she'd mended, her dark hair neatly braided. She carried herself with quiet dignity despite the weight of the day ahead. "Reckon we best get an early start," Ezekiel said, helping her up onto the wagon seat. The wooden wheels creaked as they set out. Following the rutted road toward Copper Butte, Scout trotted alongside. Nose to the ground, the morning air held a hint of autumn crispness. Clara clutched her deed papers in her lap, her knuckles white. "What if the clerk won't help us?" she asked softly. "Law's the law," Ezekiel replied, though his jaw tightened. "Your father's treaty rights are clear as day." They passed scattered homesteads where women hung laundry and men worked their fields. Some turned their backs. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. Clara sat straighter, refusing to shrink from their stares. The county clerk's office occupied a cramped corner of the courthouse. Inside, the air hung heavy with dust and the musty smell of old papers. Mr. Simmons, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up nervously as they entered. "Mr. Harrow," he stammered, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, "and Miss Worthing, isn't it?" Clara stepped forward, unfolding her deed. "Yes, sir. I've come about my father's water rights." Simmons's eyes darted to the window. Outside, Pastor Quarles stood talking with several townsmen, his presence a clear warning. "Well now," Simmons hedged, shuffling papers, "that's quite a complicated matter. You see, there are competing claims. Show us both documents," Ezekiel said firmly. His massive frame seemed to fill the small office. Side by side, the clerk's hands trembled as he retrieved two folders. Pastor Quarles' purchase agreement is quite recent. Properly notarized, he laid out both papers. Ezekiel leaned forward, his shadow falling across the desk. "And Miss Worthing's inheritance through the treaty." "Well, yes, that exists too. But then you know which claim holds legal priority," Ezekiel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Simmons mopped his brow again. The treaty rights would precede. Technically speaking, he glanced fearfully toward the window. "Ain't nothing technical about it," Ezekiel growled. "It's simple justice." Clara placed her hand on the clerk's desk. "Mr. Simmons," she said gently, "I know you're in a difficult position, but my father believed in the law's protection. So do I." The clerk looked into her steady gaze. Something in her quiet dignity seemed to strengthen his resolve. He straightened his shoulders slightly. "You're right, of course," he said. "The treaty claim is primary. I'll make note of it officially." He began writing in his ledger with shaking hands. They left the courthouse into bright mid-morning sun. Clara's relief showed in her softened shoulders, though she knew this was far from over. "We need supplies," Ezekiel said. Might as well get them while we're here." The general store's bell jingled as they entered. The owner, Mr. Peterson, gave them a cautious nod. Other customers whispered behind their hands. Clara held her head high as she selected needles, thread, and soap. A tall Navajo man in worn buckskins stood examining ropes near the door. His weathered face creased in a smile as Ezekiel approached. "Samuel Beggy," Ezekiel said warmly. "Been a while. Too long, my friend." Samuel's handshake was firm. His eyes held memory of the day Ezekiel had pulled him from beneath stampeding cattle. "Miss Clara Worthing," Ezekiel introduced. "Samuel's the best tracker in 3 territories." Samuel inclined his head respectfully. "I have heard of your courage, Miss Worthing, and of certain men who mistake power for right." His meaning was clear. Any friend of Mr. Harrow's is welcome. Clara replied softly. "Should trouble find you," Samuel said, "remember you have friends who walk quiet paths." He touched his hat brim and slipped out, leaving the promise of aid hanging in the air. The wagon ride home was easier, despite the afternoon heat. Clara's spirits lifted as they left town behind. The familiar sight of Ezekiel's ranch brought unexpected comfort. When had she started thinking of it as home? Evening settled soft and purple over the land. After a simple supper, Clara noticed Ezekiel struggling one-handed with a torn shirt sleeve. "Let me help with that," she said, taking up needle and thread. The lamplight cast a warm glow as she worked, her stitches neat and sure. Ezekiel watched her capable hands, remembering other evenings when his wife had mended by this same light. The thought brought more peace than pain. Clara finished the final stitch, then paused, her fingers brushing the scar tissue on his weathered hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing beside me today, for risking so much." He looked up, meeting her eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, tender as a morning glory unfurling in dawn light. Time stretched, sweet and still as honey, dripping from a comb. Scout's bark broke the spell. Clara bent to her mending again, cheeks flushed, but the warmth remained. Like embers banking down for a long night's glow, they worked in companionable silence as stars emerged above the ranch. Each stitch seemed to bind them closer, weaving something new from threads of loss and hope. Morning dew sparkled on the grass as Clara stepped out onto the cabin's front porch. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across Ezekiel's ranch. She breathed in deeply, savoring the clean air and peaceful quiet that had become familiar. Over these past days, inside the cabin, she heard Ezekiel moving about, the floorboards creaking under his heavy steps. The routine they'd fallen into felt as natural as breathing. She would wake early to start the coffee while he tended to the morning feeding. Then they'd share breakfast, their comfortable silence punctuated by simple conversation about the day ahead. Clara gathered her skirts and made her way to the small patch of earth she'd cleared beside the cabin. Kneeling in the soft dirt, she pulled tiny seed packets from her apron pocket, vegetables and herbs she'd gotten from the general store. Her fingers worked the soil, creating neat rows just as her father had taught her. "Reckon that garden." Fine, Ezekiel's deep voice came from behind her. She turned to see him standing there, his broad shoulders blocking the morning sun. "I hope so," Clara replied, patting the earth around a tomato seed. "Been too long since I've had my hands in good soil." Ezekiel nodded, watching her work. "Got something to show you, if you're of a mind." Clara brushed the dirt from her hands and followed him to the corral. There stood a dappled gray mare, gentle-eyed and calm. "This here's Maple," Ezekiel said, running a hand along the horse's neck. "Thought maybe you'd like to learn to ride her proper." Clara's heart quickened. "I'd like that very much." Over the next hour, Ezekiel showed her how to saddle and mount, his large hands steady and sure as he helped her up. The mare stood patient beneath her, sensing her nervousness. "Just feel her rhythm," he instructed, leading them slowly around the corral. "Let your body move with hers." By midday, Clara had gained enough confidence to walk Maple on her own. Her cheeks flushed with accomplishment as Ezekiel watched from the fence, approval clear in his eyes. "You're a natural," he said, and the pride in his voice made her smile deepen. That evening, as the sun began its descent, Ezekiel saddled both Maple and his own horse. "Care to see more of the ranch?" They rode side by side across the rolling landscape, the cooling air carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. Clara felt herself relaxing into the saddle, matching Maple's easy gait. When a jackrabbit darted across their path, she let out a startled laugh that echoed across the open range. Ezekiel's own deep chuckle joined hers. "Been a while since I heard laughter out here," he said softly. They stopped at a high point overlooking the valley, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Scout ran circles around their horses, barking playfully at prairie dogs. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, taking in the vast expanse. "That it is." But when she turned, Ezekiel wasn't looking at the sunset. His eyes were on her, filled with something that made her heart flutter. Back at the cabin, Ezekiel built up the fire while Clara prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The familiar domestic sounds, the crack of kindling, the clatter of plates, the whisper of pages as Clara opened her Bible filled the space with warmth. After they'd eaten, Clara began to read from the Psalms, her voice steady and clear in the firelit room. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Ezekiel sat in his chair, eyes closed, letting her words wash over him. When she finished, silence settled between them, comfortable as an old quilt. "Never thought I'd hear scripture read in this cabin again," he said finally. "Sarah, my wife, she used to read every evening." Clara set the Bible gently on the table. "Tell me about her." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "She was kind, strong in her faith. Made this place a real home." He drew a deep breath. "When she and our little girl took sick, thought I'd never feel whole again. Figured love was something I'd buried with them." His eyes met Clara's across the table. "Been proven wrong about that." Clara's hand trembled as she reached across the rough wooden surface. "I never thought." She swallowed hard. "In the revival show, men only saw what they wanted to see. My size, my scars. Never thought one would look past all that to see me." Large hand covered hers, warm and calloused. "I see you, Clara, Bellworthing. See your strength, your gentle heart, your faith." Firelight danced across their joined hands as tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. The moment felt fragile as spun glass, yet solid as the foundation beneath them. In the hearth, a log settled, sending sparks up the chimney like stars. Outside, a coyote called into the gathering night. Scout wind softly from his place by the door. But in the cabin's warm circle of light, Clara and Ezekiel sat with their hands entwined, hearts opening to a love neither had expected to find. A week had passed since their quiet evening by the fire, and now Clara stood before the wooden courthouse in Copper Butte, her heart hammering against her ribs. The morning sun beat down on the gathered crowd, dust swirling in the warm breeze. Ezekiel's solid presence beside her gave her strength as they climbed the worn steps. The courthouse's main room was already packed with townsfolk, their bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in the stuffy space. The creak of wooden benches and shuffle of boots filled the air as Clara and Ezekiel made their way forward. She caught glimpses of familiar faces, some kind, others hostile, many simply curious. Judge Wilson, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, sat behind his elevated stair. I sat behind his elevated stair desk, fanning himself with a folded paper. The county clerk, Mr. Peterson, arranged documents on a small table nearby, his hands trembling slightly. Samuel Begay stood quietly near the back wall, his dark eyes watchful and supportive. Pastor Quarles was already there, dressed in his Sunday best, a circle of supporters around him. His face wore the same righteous expression she remembered from his revival shows, and Clara felt her old scars burn at the sight of him. But she straightened her spine, remembering the strength she'd found in Ezekiel's kitchen, in his gentle acceptance of her. "This meeting of the County Water Rights Commission will now come to order," Judge Wilson announced, tapping his gavel. The room gradually quieted. "We're here to address competing claims to the artesian spring on the north boundary of Harrow Ranch." Quarles stepped forward first, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Good people of Copper Butte," he began, his voice rising with practiced authority, "we face a grave deception. This woman," he pointed at Clara, "claims rights to water that rightfully belongs to the community. She waves a questionable deed and spins tales of Indian heritage, seeking to deny honest ranchers their livelihood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Quarles continued, his voice growing fiercer. "I have documentation showing the spring lies on common land. Are we to let an outsider, a woman of suspicious background, take control of what God provided for all?" Several voices called out in agreement. Clara felt the weight of hostile stares, but Ezekiel's hand brushed her arm, steadying her. "Furthermore," Quarles proclaimed, "this woman's character is well known to me. I took her into my revival ministry out of Christian charity, only to have her steal and flee. Now she's deceived our neighbor Harrow, using feminine wiles to turn him against his own community. That's a lie." The words burst from Clara before she could stop them. The room fell silent. Judge Wilson peered down at her. "Miss Worthing, you may approach and state your case." Clara walked forward on trembling legs. She pulled her father's deed from her satchel, along with the small leather pouch containing his few remaining possessions. Her voice came out soft at first, but grew stronger with each word. "My father was John Worthing, born to a Choctaw mother in Indian Territory. He came west with legal rights to water and land granted by treaty. She held up the deed. This document bears the territorial seal. The spring was his legitimate claim, passed to me upon his death." She opened the leather pouch, removing a small carved pendant. "This was his mother's, my grandmother's. I carry it to remember where I come from and the dignity of my people." Her fingers traced the worn designs. "Pastor Quarles speaks of my character, but he's the one who held me captive. Who," her voice caught, but she pressed on, "who displayed me like an animal, who beat me when I refused to play his cruel games." Shocked whispers filled the room. Clara's cheeks burned, but she held her head high. "I escaped with nothing but my father's deed and the clothes they'd taken. From me, I found shelter with Mr. Harrow, who showed me true Christian kindness." She turned to face the crowd directly. "I don't wish to deny water to anyone. The spring can support many herds, many families. I only ask for what's legally mine and the right to live in peace." Several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes. Samuel Begay nodded slowly from his place by the wall. Even the clerk looked moved, though he quickly buried his face in his papers when Quarles glared his way. "Lies and manipulation," Quarles thundered. "Where's proof of this supposed heritage? Anyone can wave papers and claim Indian blood. I can speak to that." Ezekiel's deep voice cut through the noise as he stepped forward. The room stilled. Everyone knew the giant rancher rarely spoke in public. "I've watched Miss Worthing pray, heard her speak of her father's teachings, seen her work my land with knowledge passed down through generations." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "But more than that, I've seen her show forgiveness to those who mock her. Seen her hold her head high in church while folks whisper cruel words. His voice grew harder. "We gather here every Sunday, speaking of love and mercy. Then we walk out those doors and treat a good woman like she's less than human. What kind of town have we become?" The silence that followed felt heavy with shame. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "The deed appears authentic, bearing territorial seals. Unless Pastor Quarles can produce stronger evidence for his claim." He left the sentence hanging. Quarles sputtered, his face reddening. "This is an outrage. The town won't stand for it." But looking around the room, Clara saw something had shifted. Women who'd turned away now met her eyes with small smiles. Men who'd clustered around Quarles began drifting toward the edges of the crowd. Samuel Begay stepped forward to shake Ezekiel's hand, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "Your words. Honor the truth, friend." The judge tapped his gavel. "I'll take this matter under advisement and issue a final ruling next week. But preliminary findings support Miss Worthing's claim." He peered over his spectacles at Quarles. "I suggest any parties spreading false accusations consider the legal consequences of slander." The crowd began to disperse, their quiet conversations carrying a new tone. Several people nodded to Clara as they passed. A young mother pressed a small loaf of bread into her hands with a whispered, "God bless you." Later that evening, Clara sat on Ezekiel's porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and purple. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years, as though a great weight had begun to lift. The screen door creaked, and Ezekiel stepped out, holding something behind his back. "Made this for you," he said gruffly, presenting a wooden cross, carefully carved from barn timber. The wood was smooth and golden, shaped with obvious care. "Figured you might want something of your own, to mark your place here." Clara ran her fingers over the polished surface, feeling the love worked into every detail. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ezekiel sat beside her on the porch step. "Reckon we should thank the Lord for today." Clara nodded, clutching the cross to her heart. As they bowed their heads, the evening breeze carried the scent of sage and prairie grass as they prayed together, asking for continued guidance on their shared path. Morning light streamed through the kitchen window as Ezekiel and Clara shared breakfast. The air felt different, somehow lighter, full of possibility after yesterday's victory at the courthouse. Scout, the old cattle dog, lay contentedly at Clara's feet while she passed Ezekiel another biscuit. "Thought we might check the south pasture fence today," Ezekiel said, spreading honey on the warm bread. "Could use an extra pair of hands." Clara's face brightened. "I'd like that. Never mended fence before, but I'm willing to learn." The morning passed in comfortable work. Ezekiel showed Clara how to stretch wire between posts, his large hands gentle as they guided hers on the tools. The spring breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, and Clara found herself humming as they worked. "You've got a nice voice," Ezekiel commented, hammering a staple into a post. Clara blushed. "My father taught me songs, both English hymns and Choctaw melodies. Said music speaks straight to the soul." They broke for a simple lunch of jerky and apples in the shade of a cottonwood. Clara watched a hawk circle overhead while Ezekiel studied. The land stretching before them. "Been thinking," he said slowly. "That spring of yours, it's powerful enough to water more than just my herd." Clara nodded. "I've thought the same. Seems wrong to keep such abundance to ourselves. A tea could help." "Other families get started," Ezekiel continued. "One's willing to work honest and treat folks fair." He glanced at her. "Maybe build something good here. A place where people are judged by their hearts, not their looks or background." Clara's voice held both hope and old hurt. "Exactly that." Ezekiel's hand found hers, rough palm against smooth. "You've shown me there's more to life than just surviving alone." They finished the fence work as afternoon mellowed toward evening. Back at the ranch, they moved easily around each other in the kitchen, preparing supper together. Clara kneaded dough for fresh bread, while Ezekiel chopped vegetables for stew. The domestic rhythm felt natural, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, they settled by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Clara began to sing softly. Choctaw lullaby her father had sung to her as a child. The foreign words flowed like water, speaking of stars and gentle nights and a mother's love. Ezekiel watched her, his heart full to bursting. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the gentle curves of her face. Here was a woman who'd faced cruelty, yet kept her kindness, who'd known mockery but held on to dignity, who saw past his gruff exterior to the lonely soul beneath. When the song ended, silence filled the room like a prayer. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Clara," he said roughly, then paused to find the right words. "I reckon I love you." Clara's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Oh, Ezekiel," she whispered, "I love you too. For a while now." He reached for her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "Been alone so long, I forgot what it was to share life with someone, to dream bigger than just making it through each day. And now," Clara asked softly, "now I see a future worth building. Together, if you're willing." His voice grew husky. "Would you consider marriage? Making this your permanent home?" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to home, to marriage, to building something good together." Ezekiel drew her close, his kiss gentle and sweet. Clara's arms wound around his neck as she returned the kiss with shy passion. They finally parted. Both were smiling like youngsters. They talked long into the evening, sharing dreams of joining their resources, her water rights and his cattle, knowledge to help other hardworking families get established, of making their ranch a place where people could find second chances, just as they had found their own. Later, after Clara had retired to her room, Ezekiel lay in his bed, feeling a peace he hadn't known since losing his first wife and daughter years ago. The familiar ache of grief was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, his heart was full of gratitude that God had seen fit to grant him another chance at love and family. He drifted off to sleep with Clara's lullaby still echoing in his mind, believing that tomorrow would bring new mercies, new joys too. Discovered together, dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Ezekiel stepped onto his porch, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. Clara stood at the railing, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. The air smelled of sage and promise. "Much obliged," she said, accepting the cup with a smile that warmed him more than any coffee could. They worked side by side that morning, mending the north pasture fence. Clara handed him nails from the leather pouch, her movements sure and steady. The rhythm of their work flowed natural-like, as if they'd been doing this together for years instead of days. "Reckon we could run twice the herd with proper irrigation from the spring," Ezekiel said, driving a nail into the weathered post. "Share the blessing with folks who need it." Clara nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "My father always said water belonged to everyone, like sunshine and God's grace." She touched the rough-hewn fence post. "We could help families start gardens, maybe even orchards someday." The afternoon sun found them in the kitchen, Clara kneading bread while Ezekiel cleaned freshly picked beans. The familiar domestic sounds. The thump of dough, the snap of beans, the crackle of the cooking fire filled the cabin with contentment. "Been thinking on building a proper wash house," Ezekiel said, his deep voice gentle. "And maybe expanding the garden plot come spring. Clara's hands stilled in the dough. "Sounds like you're planning on keeping me around, Mr. Harrow." "Reckon I am, Miss Worthing." His eyes met hers across the kitchen table. "If you're of a mind to stay." As evening settled over the land, they sat before the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara's voice rose soft and sweet in a Choctaw lullaby her father had taught her. The unfamiliar words flowing like water over stones. Ezekiel closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. When she finished, the silence held something sacred. "I love you, Clarabelle," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of his years of loneliness, his renewed hope. "Don't reckon. I planned on loving anyone again, but the Lord had other ideas." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, catching the firelight. "I love you too, Ezekiel. Never thought I'd find someone who'd see past." She gestured to her scars, her sighs. "I see you," he said firmly, taking her hand. "Just you." They spoke in quiet voices about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after, about building a life together, about making the ranch a place of welcome and healing. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like morning sunlight touching new fallen snow. "Marry me?" Ezekiel asked, against her hair. "Help me make this place what it ought to be." Clara's answer was another kiss, salty with joyful tears. Later, as crickets sang their evening chorus outside, Ezekiel lay in his bed, peace settling over him like a familiar blanket. For the first time since losing his wife and daughter, sleep came easy, unmarred by grief's sharp edges. His last thought before drifting off was a prayer of gratitude for second chances and the mysterious ways of God's grace. The morning sun revealed the ranch's devastation in harsh detail. Ezekiel stood amid the smoldering ruins of his barn, the acrid smell of burnt wood and flesh making his eyes water. Scout whimpered at his heels as they surveyed the damage. Dead cattle lay scattered across the pasture, their bodies black and twisted. These weren't just livestock, they were years of careful breeding, gentle creatures he'd known since they were calves. Each one had a name, each loss cut deep. His big hands trembled as he hitched the workhorses to drag the carcasses. The animals had suffered slow deaths, trapped in their pens while smoke filled their lungs. Quarles's men had made sure of that, barring the doors before setting the fire. "Ain't right," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. The shovel struck hard ground again and again as he dug graves for his herd. Ain't Christian neither. By midday, his shoulders ached from the constant work. The silence pressed in around him, no lowing cattle, no Clara humming hymns from the kitchen porch, no life stirring except the harsh cry of circling buzzards. He'd gotten used to the sounds of companionship these past weeks. Now the quiet felt like a physical weight. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ezekiel sank onto his porch steps. The wooden cross he'd carved for Clara lay in pieces by the door, snapped clean through. His hands were raw from digging. His throat tight with unshed tears, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, bright and cold as diamonds. Ezekiel tilted, his face upward, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord, I ain't been much for asking favors. Lost my way some when Sarah and little Mary died." He swallowed hard. "But Clara, she brought your light back into this place. Don't reckon I deserve another chance at happiness, but she surely deserves better than what those men plan." The night wind carried no answer, but something shifted in Ezekiel's heart. The crushing despair lifted, replaced by steel-hard purpose. He wouldn't surrender to grief again. Clara needed him strong. A soft whistle from the darkness brought him to his feet. Samuel Begay emerged from the shadows, leading his paint pony. The Navajo tracker's face was grave as he surveyed the destruction. "They left sign," Samuel said simply. "Quarrels drives them hard, but men who burn barns leave clear trails." Ezekiel nodded, ducking inside to retrieve his Winchester. The familiar weight of the rifle brought memories of younger days of violence he'd put behind him. His finger traced the trigger guard, its temptation whispering of revenge, but Clara's voice seemed to echo in his mind. Reading from her worn Bible, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." She'd shown him a better way these past weeks. Living water, not blood, would heal this land. He set the rifle aside and instead picked up his canteen and medical kit. "We go to bring her home," he told Samuel. "Nothing more." Samuel's dark eyes. "Approved. The old ones say a warrior's greatest strength is knowing when not to strike." He pointed toward the canyons. They left at midnight, riding northeast, following the dry creek bed. Ezekiel saddled his big bay, checking the cinch twice. Scout whined, wanting to follow. "Stay, boy," Ezekiel commanded. "Guard the house." The dog sat obediently, though his tail drooped. The night wind cut sharp as a knife as they rode out, moonlight painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Samuel led, reading sign Ezekiel could barely see a displaced stone here, broken. Sage there, the story of Clara's capture, written in the dust. "They're making for the box canyon," Samuel murmured. "Think to trap themselves." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Then we'll give them what they expect. Just not how they expect it." His hands clenched the reins as they urged their horses forward into the darkness, faith and determination lighting their way. Dawn painted the canyon walls in streaks of amber and rose. Samuel Begay crouched low, his weathered fingers brushing dirt from fresh hoofprints. He gestured to Ezekiel, pointing toward a narrow trail winding up through scrub oak and granite. "3 horses," Samuel murmured. "One carrying more weight than usual. They passed here before midnight." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. His own mount shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. The morning air bit cold and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and morning dew. Scout, his loyal dog, kept close to the horse's heels, nose working the trail. They followed the tracks higher into the hills until Samuel raised his hand. Through a screen of juniper, they spotted an old mission shack, its adobe walls crumbling. At the corners, a thin wisp of smoke rose from its chimney. 3 horses stood tied to a scraggly oak, their flanks still dark with sweat. "Wait," Samuel whispered, touching Ezekiel's arm. "Listen." Voices drifted from inside the shack. Quarles's distinctive drawl rose above the others, full of smug satisfaction. "By sunset, those railroad men will have your precious deed, and you'll have nothing. Just like you deserve." Clara's voice answered, steady despite evident fear. "The Lord sees your wickedness, Elias Quarles." Ezekiel's hands tightened on his rifle. He slid from his saddle, boots silent on the rocky ground. Samuel moved like a shadow beside him. Through gaps in the warped boards, they could see Clara tied to a chair, her face bruised but her spine straight. Quarles paced before her, while 2 ranch hands lounged against the wall, looking uncomfortable. The sound of approaching horses made them all turn. Through the trees came 5 riders from town, including the sheriff's deputy. Ezekiel recognized faces from Sunday services. It was time. Ezekiel burst through the door, rifle raised. Morning light flooded the dim interior. Quarles spun, reaching for his gun, but froze at the sight of the giant rancher filling the doorway. But then, deliberately, Ezekiel lowered his weapon. "I won't fight evil with evil," he declared, his voice deep and certain. "You've done enough harm with violence, Quarles." The preacher's lip curled. "You're a fool, Harrow. This woman's nothing but a lying half-breed who she's a child of God," Ezekiel cut in, "whom you've beaten and humiliated for profit. You parade as a man of faith while breaking every commandment. You mock the very scripture you pretend to preach." Clara stirred in her bonds. Despite the rope binding her, she pushed to her feet, chair and all. "My father's people were here before any of you," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "The Choctaw blood in my veins and the deed in my hand are both my birthright. Neither you nor any railroad man can steal what God and law have given me." The townsfolk who had followed shifted uneasily in the doorway. Samuel appeared beside them like a spirit, his quiet presence a reminder of deeper truths than Quarles' hatred. "I've seen how you treat those weaker than you," one of the ranch hands muttered, backing away from Quarles. "Ain't right, boss." "Christian." She quoted Psalms while you mocked her, added another townsman. "Who's really following the Lord's way?" Quarles' face twisted. "You're all blind. This woman and this love-struck fool will ruin everything we know." Ezekiel stepped forward, his shadow falling over the preacher. "You've ruined yourself, Elias, with every lie, every cruel act, every time you used God's name to justify greed." The morning light streamed stronger through the windows now, illuminating dust motes and guilty faces. Clara stood tall despite her bonds, her dignity unmarred by Quarles' abuse. The truth of who she was, her strength, her faith. Her heritage shone clearer than any deed or document could prove. One by one, the townspeople's eyes lowered, shame rising to replace prejudice. They had followed a false prophet, and now they knew it. The standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Quarles' hand still hovered near his gun, but the righteous fire had gone out of his eyes, replaced by the desperate look of a man seeing his masks stripped away. Sheriff Morton stepped into the mission. Shack, his boots heavy on creaking floorboards. The morning light streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across weathered walls. Quarles' men shifted uneasily, their expressions darkening with shame as they looked between their leader and the bound Clara. "You ain't got no right," Quarles snarled, but his voice wavered. "Okay." His followers began backing away, leaving him alone. In his corner of righteous deceit, Samuel Begay moved like water, silent and swift. When Quarles reached for his gun, Samuel was already there, disarming him with practiced ease. The preacher stumbled backward, his false authority crumbling like sand. "The Lord sees all," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite her bonds. "Even in darkness, His truth shines forth." Ezekiel's large hands trembled as he untied the ropes around Clara's wrists. Red marks showed where they'd bit into her skin, but her eyes held only strength. When the last knot fell away, she collapsed into his arms, their tears mingling as they held each other. "Got your message 3 days back," Sheriff Morton said to Samuel, who nodded once. "Good thing, too." Been watching Quarles a spell, gathering evidence of his dealings. The sheriff turned to Quarles, pulling out iron handcuffs that glinted in the dawn light. "Arson, fraud, kidnapping, reckon that'll keep you occupied for quite some time, preacher." The ride back to Copper Butte was long but peaceful. Clara rode double with Ezekiel, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his broad back. The morning sun warmed their faces as they emerged from the Canyonlands dot in the county courthouse. The judge sat stern-faced behind his desk, examining Clara's deed through wire-rimmed spectacles. "This document is properly registered and witnessed," he declared, setting it down with authority. "The water rights belong to Miss Worthing through her father's Choctaw inheritance. That's final." Outside on the courthouse steps, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Peterson, who'd once whispered cruel words about Clara's size, approached with a basket of fresh bread. "For your supper," she said, eyes downcast. "And I'm sorry for my unkindness." More townspeople gathered, shame and regret evident in their stance. Tom Wheeler, the lumber mill owner, stepped forward. "Your barn, Mr. Harrow. We'd like to help. Rebuild it, got timber ready to cut. And I've got tools to lend," called out the blacksmith. "My boys can help with the raising," offered Farmer Jenkins. Clara squeezed Ezekiel's hand, tears welling in her eyes, not from pain this time, but from the healing power of community transformed. Ezekiel's throat tightened as he nodded his acceptance the next day. Wagons rolled onto Ezekiel's ranch, loaded with lumber and supplies. Men who'd once turned away in church now worked shoulder to shoulder, raising new beams toward the sky. Women brought food and encouragement. While children cleared debris from the burnt barn, Clara moved among them, offering water and thanks. Her smile brightened the worksite, and folks who'd never looked her in the eye before found themselves drawn to her gentle spirit. She shared stories of her father's wisdom, and they listened, learning to see her heritage as strength rather than shame. Ezekiel worked alongside his neighbors, his powerful arms lifting and steadying the fresh-cut beams. Each nail-driven home felt like a promise kept, each board a step toward redemption, not just for his ranch, but for the whole community. Samuel Begay stayed to help as well, his quiet presence a reminder that friendship knows no boundaries. He worked with skilled precision, showing younger men better ways to join the timber. His knowledge freely shared and gratefully received. As the sun began to set, the barn skeleton stood tall against the purple sky. Clara and Ezekiel stood back, arms around each other, watching their neighbors pack up tools and head home with promises to return tomorrow. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Clara whispered, leaning her head against Ezekiel's shoulder. "He does," Ezekiel agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "That he surely does." Morning dew sparkled on fresh-cut lumber as the rebuilt barn stood proud against the summer sky. The scent of new pine mixed with wild sage carried on the breeze. Where charred ruins had marked defeat just weeks ago, now stood a testament to community renewed, each beam and board put up by neighbors' hands working together around the artesian spring. Lush grass spread like a green carpet. Children from nearby farms splashed and giggled as they filled wooden buckets, their mothers calling gentle reminders not to play too long. The water flowed clean and steady, enough for all who came with fair payment and grateful hearts. Ezekiel adjusted his string tie, his Sunday best fitting a bit tight across broad shoulders, more used to work shirts. His weathered hands, usually rough from ranch work, were scrubbed clean. He stood beneath the old oak tree, its branches spreading wide to shelter the gathering. Beside him, Clara Belle glowed in a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, her dark hair crowned with white wildflowers. The morning light caught the proud lift of her chin, the joy in her eyes replacing old shadows of fear. She'd laid aside her usual practical skirts for this one precious dress, though she'd insisted on keeping her boots beneath, practical as always. Samuel Begay stood among the witnesses, his normally reserved expression softened with rare warmth. He'd brought a blanket woven in sacred patterns as a wedding gift, the colors rich with meaning and blessing. Around him, townsfolk who'd once whispered cruel words now dabbed at eyes with handkerchiefs. Moved by the sight before them, the new preacher, a kind-faced man from 2 towns over, opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying across the peaceful ranch land. Scout, Ezekiel's faithful dog, sat attentively at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the grass. Clara's hand trembled slightly as Ezekiel took it in his own. His giant fingers engulfed hers with infinite gentleness, steadying her. The simple gold bands they exchanged caught sunlight like promises made solid. "I do," Ezekiel's deep voice rumbled, emotion making the words rough. He who had lived so long in silence now spoke his vows clear and strong, each word a declaration of love renewed. "I do," Clara answered, her voice steady and sure. She who had once hidden from cruel eyes now stood tall, claiming her place in the light. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ezekiel leaned down to kiss his bride. Their lips met soft and sweet, a seal on promises spoken and unspoken. Someone in the crowd sniffled loudly as they turned to face their guests. Ezekiel bent close to Clara's ear. "Thought my life ended years ago," he whispered, voice thick with wonder, "but now it truly begins." Clara nodded, tears of joy making her eyes bright. Her fingers tightened on his arm, grounding them both in this moment of grace, hand in hand. they walked across the pasture toward the celebration laid. Out under shade trees, Scout bounded ahead, barking joyfully. Children scattered in his wake, their laughter rising like music. The spring burbled its endless song. Water flowing free and clean over rocks worn smooth by time. The golden afternoon light caught Clara's smile, transforming her face with such radiance that those who saw it felt their own hearts lift in response. Ezekiel walked beside her. His usual stoic expression softened into wondering joy. Together, they moved through dappled sunlight, each step taking them further from old sorrows and deeper into the future they would build together. The sound of running water mingled with children's laughter and happy conversation. A hymn of renewal, rising sweet and clear into the endless blue sky above. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.